I think we're ready to start, and I'm going to introduce our speaker.
Do I sit or stand?
Great crowd. It's the second Loons, Suds, and Science we've had. I'm Chris Rimmer from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. I know many of you, but not all of you. And this is backed by popular demand. So Eric Hansen is our loon biologist, the loon king of Vermont, without a doubt. He's been working on loons for well over 15 years. I think we're pushing 20 now. And I won't say single-handedly, because he's had an enormous amount of help, including from some of you, volunteers around the state, but has managed to bring back Vermont's loon population, which you'll hear about. And we've had to change the name of the project from the Vermont Loon Recovery Project to the Vermont Loon Conservation Project. We've recovered them now. And it wouldn't have happened without Eric. So I'm not going to stand up here any longer. I'm going to let him just launch right in.
All right. I'd like to know, how many people is this your first Suds in Science? That's pretty good. I don't know how many they're planning each year, or each month, or whatever, how they're spread out. I know they're going to slow it down to keep it during the winter. And
oh, I should have mentioned, there's one more next month on old growth forests from many years ago. It'll be a fascinating talk by Charlie Cogwell. Then we're going to take a break and come back in September.
So anyway, they're definitely kind of a neat thing. And for those who may not be familiar with VCE, we're kind of this wildlife research group that's just based down the road here. I'm VCE North. I'm based in Craftsbury, Vermont, as a seasonal biologist up there. But there's about 9, 10, 11 staff. I can't even keep track. Doing work from songbirds to butterflies to vernal pools and amphibians, all the way to the Dominican Republic, occasionally down to South America, up to the Canadian Maritimes, and out to the plains. We now have Roz leading grassland work as a sort of coordinating a national effort. So there's lots of things going on, as well as starting this Vermont Atlas of Life project, which will hopefully have lots of sub-projects to get all of you involved, to be looking at what's out your back doors and all of that sort of thing. So it's, fun to be back. When I was here in October, I think, I was mainly told just a lot of different loon stories, and it was just a lot of fun. This time I'm going to be coming at a little more, not I would say scripted, but I just spent, every spring we get together with the other loon groups, and we'll get, it's New Hampshire and Maine and Mass, a group called Biodiversity Research Institute, which does a lot of loon research, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, EPA sometimes. Occasionally Canadian guys come down. Also, there's researchers around the country who follow banded birds and yodeling and do all sorts of neat stuff. So I'm going to share some of their findings and that, and then as well as we'll get into the crowd of all of that. But I think, Brett, before we actually begin, how many loon volunteers who've helped me at some point do we have here? We have Henry Dandino, Mary Daly, Mitzi Queen. All right. These guys are the bread and butter of, I think, the Vermont Loon Conservation Project. We have close to 300 volunteers. Some of those people help out for 20 minutes one time in the summer, which is great because it's an opportunity for that type of help. Other people, like Henry, should get paid. He is out there and he covers Somerset Reservoir as well as southern Vermont. I actually call him the Southern Vermont Loon Biologist because he really covers the lower third of the state. And it's incredible what he does. And I was wondering if you'd like, if you have a favorite loon story that you guys could just quickly share. So, Henry?
Several years ago, I was watching the banded male that we did back in '97 or something like that. Of course, he was an especially large male, if I recall. And I think it was the last time I actually identified him with his bands, etc., because I'm not all that good at that all the time. But I was watching him on this particular day, and he went down and he came back up with a fish. It was a sucker that had to be 15 inches long. And I said, there's no way he's going to be able to eat that fish. And he tossed that fish up and down and back and forth over half an hour. And I said, yep, I'm going to watch him choke to death. And I think at that time, I figured that he was 30 years old for sure, that we had watched him. And ultimately, he swallowed that fish. And so he was successful, and he lived to talk about it, I guess.
So Henry covers Somerset Reservoir. He used to work for the power company down there, and we have 3 pairs on that. And it's a big water body. And when he retired a few years ago, he bought a boat so he could continue monitoring out there for us.
Hooray for Henry.
Yeah, it's 2,000 acres. Yeah, I didn't look at the water ski equipment in the back, but no. And then we have Mary Daly from Martin's Pond.
Martin's Pond up in Peacham. I started in 1999 when Eric,
My second year.
he called me the year before and wanted to know if we were interested, and so I said sure. And then we launched the platform the first time in '99, and we had a pair that was on the pond for several years. I lost track of how many years. And they got so familiar with us that when I was working on the platform in the spring, they would come and talk to me about it. You know, they have this little kind of call that they do, and I talk back to them. And then we banded that pair one evening. That was pretty exciting. And a couple of years later, she got in a fight with another intruder, and she lost the bottom part of her mandible, so she was very recognizable, because I don't know if you know, you can't really tear them apart unless you've got bands on their legs. And I thought that she was going to be very vulnerable to being overtaken by another intruder loon, but she lasted a couple more years. And I was worried about her being able to feed the babies and all kinds of stuff. She just managed just fine. So, and then after she got bumped off the pond, because that does happen, we found her on Little Mud, which was very close to Martin's Pond, and then there was a question whether or not she did another pair down on Harvey's Lake, which was a little further away. Eric sent me a picture of a loon with a broken lower mandible, and I never could really tell from that picture whether it was my same lady or not, but it's been really interesting to be part of this loon project. I could tell you a half a dozen more stories, but I'll stop.
What does it take to ban the loon?
I could actually explain that if you want. And then just as Mitzi Queen from Halls Lake, where we still might be having a pair starting to form, but it takes years and decades sometimes, and sometimes never. It's a smaller lake up in Newberry.
It's a lake without many inlets or coves, and too much activity, I think, on the lake.
It's also a little distant from loons tend to like to be in regions of lakes, so having several in the area really helps versus a lake that's a little further out. And Newberry's just a little further out from some of the Groton area in Peacham, where Mary is. So, but for banding, back in '99 and 2000, we did a bunch of banding in cooperation with the group Biodiversity Research Institute, which sort of heads up a lot of that work for the EPA during a mercury study. It was a Northeast regional thing, but they were also doing sampling of fish, of sediments, of the watershed, and lots of water chemistry. And so loons were just kind of one piece of the puzzle, and that they were getting some samples from to sort of see how mercury flows through the system. And loons are a pretty good way to do that, top of the food chain. And what we found in Vermont is actually most of our birds are pretty low in mercury. And a lot of that has to do with our water chemistry and our soils, because it takes a certain type of bacteria to take mercury that can come in from the atmosphere mostly, although it's naturally occurring as well, and it builds up in the food chain. But it takes this bacteria to methylate it, to make it available for tissues and to build up that way. There are places, though, especially in eastern Maine and up in Nova Scotia, where mercury levels are high enough that they're pretty sure that they're seeing some effects on reproduction. It doesn't actually kill the bird. It's more of the Mad Hatter. It makes them a little crazy and lazy. They're with the chicks. They're not feeding the chicks. They're next to a nest, but not getting on the nest. If you came and looked at it and saw the birds out there, you'd think, oh, no problem. They're fine. But it's these little subtle behavioral changes with thousands of hours of watching normal birds with low mercury and these high mercury birds. Some of that has come out. So it's kind of a good little indicator of what's going on in that level. And for the banding, you go out at night with spotlights. And the only banding we do now is if we got a bird caught in fishing line or, pretty much with fishing line or something like that. And we'll give it a shot. Catching a bird free swimming is it's a total random process. You don't have no idea if you're going to have any luck or not. But when they have a chick with them, they stick to defend the chick. We pretend we're a third loon. They're so territorial that we can just give little hoots and calls and play whale calls. And if we're not having much success, we'll go to the Yodel call, which is the territorial call. The whale call is sort of that wolf call, they call it. And it's more of a communication call. We don't want to get them too upset. But if, let's say, that bird's just staying 20 feet out and we can't get it, we might go to the Yodel, which is it's this crescendo and then this up and down, up and down, and up and down. I don't do that one in public. Anyway, there's sort of a whoop, 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 whoop. You know, just to give a feeling of what it sounds like. And only the males do it. And so anyway, that's a way to kind of get them. We have started using that call with some of the fishing line, or not fishing line birds, but birds that get caught on little ponds that are not much bigger than this room or twice the size of the room. Because what we find is that if there's no place for that loon to go, it might actually stay on the surface instead of dive. Because usually when we go out on these little ponds and you put a spotlight on it, the loon dives. And then you're looking, pops up, put a spotlight on it, it dives again. And unless you get lucky, you're not going to catch it. But I've done it twice now with the Yodel, and the bird is all of a sudden like frozen. It's like, oh my gosh, what's going on? I got an angry male coming after me, and I better turn around and fight instead of just be a coward. And so they'll actually might come in at us, and we'll get the net out with a big salmon dip net. And then we'll put a towel over their head, and put them in our laps, take them out, and then put bands on them or take some blood samples or something like that. That's actually a good lead into, we might actually be doing some banding maybe this year, but more likely next year as part of a big national health assessment. This group BRI has done a lot of sort of the leading research for loons, and they landed a pretty big grant from an individual, the Rickards Fund, I think is the name of it, Rickards Foundation, to do all sorts of things. But one of the best things is this sort of create a baseline study of what is normal. And so they're gonna be doing, actually I should go to the page, but of all the different parameters they're testing. But they're going to do hematology, so white blood cell counts, red blood cells, pack cell counts, cell morphology. Is there anything unusual, sort of in that way? Plasma biochemistry, so that's going to help give an idea of liver and kidney function. Metabolic stresses. In relation to that, test for some hormones. You can test for sort of stress hormones that birds that might have lots of little tiny things, like a contaminated bird might have higher levels, or a bird with lots of parasites might have higher levels, things like that. So parasitology would be another part of it. Toxicology, so they'll send a lot of samples out for not only mercury and other things, but heavy metals, cyanotoxins, pesticides, PCBs, flame retardants. They're finding all of these things out there. And loons are just one of the places that, you know, again, a top of the food chain place to sort of check. Avian diseases, we hear about the ones that affect people and some of the other things, but there's hundreds and hundreds of avian diseases. There's a guy named Mark Pokris out of Tufts who is absolutely amazing. 25 years ago, he started taking in loons and trying to figure out why they died. He's now necropsied, I think, probably close to 2,000 loons in his career. And unfortunately, he's retiring, but he's going to keep going. He's going to still help set up lab and make sure things keep going. And that's where we send all our birds. And so he's seeing viruses popping up that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And it may be that these viruses are always there, but they're just finally having an effect where, you know, again, maybe a stressed bird, and all of a sudden now it affects them where it didn't before. So some neat stuff going on there. Immunology, so that's sort of the whole kit and caboodle, the whole stress level from that. There's some genetic work going on, so just sort of seeing who these birds are. If you find them in the ocean and you take a feather sample, we might be able to pinpoint where they came from with that, so that could be kind of interesting. And then as well as the necropsy exams that we keep getting. I had 3 birds this summer, or actually 5 birds this summer that I've collected that had died. And some of them, outwardly, we couldn't tell what they were. They looked like maybe got beat up by another loon, territorial fight. Ends up that 3 of them had ingested lead, and 1 had high blood levels. And we wouldn't have known that had we not done the necropsy. So that's been pretty critical to show that, you know, yes, lead is still an issue, even though we've banned some of the sinkers, not all of them, and things like that. So anyway, that's kind of a neat thing that they're going to be doing, and hopefully we'll be able to help out with that part. And I might as well keep going on the disease part, because we often don't think about that, but it's definitely some interesting stuff. There was a lady from Smithsonian who came to speak this last time, Ellen Martinson, who actually has a place in Vermont. I'm going to have to connect with her at some point. But she studies malaria. And malaria is all over the southern, we think of it as a southern species. Humans we're host to 15 different species, supposedly. I know nothing about malaria except for what she's been telling us. And the effects of malaria can be like internal bleeding, red blood cell damage, liver failure, spleen enlargement, anemia. Again, not necessarily always things that are going to kill you, but stuff that can make you immune suppressed. And other things can happen. You might get in a fight with another loon, and that might be your actual go-away call. But it may have been that you were weak and something like that. And she was telling me that grackles and robins are regular carriers of malaria, and but they've co-evolved with it, and they're doing okay with what they have. She also told us all about birds that go into zoos and why they have to be kept in closed captivity and really watch closely. If you put like a snowy owl or a penguin at the Smithsonian, at the Washington D.C. Zoo outside, it's going to die within a few weeks because of malaria. All the other birds around are going to be vectors, or somehow it's going to get to it, being out in the open like that. And so that's often one of the biggest causes of having birds out of their normal location, because they just don't have the immune system to deal with the other diseases that are out there. So they started looking at blood plate in a microscope, little drop of blood on a plate on a microscope. Hundreds and hundreds of samples have been looked at Tufts by several vets and vet students, and they haven't found anything, and this is just through visual exam. But there's a new technique called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, where they can actually sort of it helps build up what's sort of in there, amplifies a single cell or into a few copies or lots of copies, but through that they can actually detect certain things that they're looking for. And one of them is different types of malaria. And what they found in a recent sample of 128 blood samples from loons, 12% of them had a form of malaria in their blood, which seemed pretty high. And 4 of those, and there were 6 different species of malaria, 2 that no one had ever seen before, and I documented, and 4 that were definitely more southern. So whether it's in this, and I'm not sure what she meant by southern. Was it something from the breeding grounds down in the Gulf of Mexico, or was it something from like just the southern part of the range of Massachusetts and southern Vermont, New Hampshire, something like that. So anyway, it's just the beginning. It'll be really interesting to kind of see where that goes. A bigger disease issue that's been going on, and it's been going on for decades that we know of, it actually cycles, is botulism on the Great Lakes. And it's a neurotoxin produced by a bacteria, and essentially it causes paralysis. And when it gets into water birds, and loons just being one of them, mergansers, cormorants, gulls, they'll actually drown is often what the cause is. They're catching fish that have the neurotoxin, and and it goes back, the first die-offs were actually recorded in the 1950s. And they're relatively small, but they were definitely birds being found. In 1963 in southern Lake Michigan, over 3,000 loons were found dead from botulism. It comes up from the soils, it's naturally occurring, but it has to have a pathway to get up into the food chain to get to the surface. There was another die-off in northern Lake Michigan the following year, 3,500 loons that year. And then through the 70s and 80s, there were small outbreaks, 10 here, 100 there, but nothing in the thousands, until 1999. And since 1999, the estimates are upward of 30 to 40,000 loons have died on the Great Lakes, which is substantial, very substantial. And these are estimates because they're based on transect counts across beaches, because they just can't go everywhere on mainly Lake Ontario and Erie, but also they're finding them on Huron, Michigan, and I don't think southern Lake Superior has really been hit too hard yet. But what they're finding, though, is it's the introduced species into the Great Lakes are the real big factor. And where did I read? It was about Lake Champlain having something like 80 some introduced species of plants and animals in it. Great Lakes, it's like 280. From the bilges of ships that going in. And really what it is, it's they figured out the likely system is the mussels that have come in. They're filter feeders, they clear the water, but they promoted a plant called Kedavra. And that's just like proliferated, which is great for a while, but then it dies. And then it produces in huge quantities, dies, and causes anaerobic conditions where the bacteria thrive. And that's what then allows the toxin to become available. And then another introduced fish, the ground goby, this little tiny fish, eats all that stuff, and then that's what comes up to the surface, and that's what the birds are eating. And that's and it's associated in late October, early November in migration. That seems to be when it's peaking. Anyway, so that's sort of what's going on there. They've done some feather genetics of some of these birds, and they think that they're coming just north, up in central Ontario. What's interesting, though, is the breeding bird surveys, which is kind of the only way they're tracking loons in Ontario, other than some sort of more sporadic counting. They're not seeing any declines, which is, you think 30,000 loons, there's got to be a decline somewhere. But there's probably well over 500,000 in Ontario or something like that. Or 400,000 or something. It's huge numbers. But a lot of those are way north. So it potentially could be that. We know some of the birds were from Wisconsin, so it's not just central Ontario, because there was a banded bird that was involved. But it may also be that in loons, in a typical year, 70 to 80% of the birds breed, but then there's this floater population, non-breeders, that we call them. And they can replace breeders really quick. They're always kind of waiting. They're always waiting for a territory. And so it may be that they're just not showing up yet as far as a decline, but maybe those non-breeders are kind of getting brought into the pool, and replacing those dead birds. So anyway, so it's kind of we're hoping that maybe someday it'll stabilize naturally, but again, these invasive species have just a different way of they're having an effect, and so we'll see what happens after that. The other one that was talked about was a guy named Jim Haney from UNH. He came over to talk about cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins, and they're finding them in all sorts of different systems. Down in southeast United States a few years ago, there were 71 bald eagles that died of cyanotoxins, where they're eating coots that were picking it up from plant matter that was covered with this bacteria, and on hydrilla plants. And they tested a few eggs, and they're finding some elevated levels of an amino acid called BMAA that's produced by cyanobacteria. Again, not necessarily lethal levels, but enough to potentially cause some issues. So it's, again, another one of those things that's just going to be kind of monitored over time. So, lots of this sort of underlying stuff going on that has nothing to do with rafts and signs and education, which is kind of what we do. But it'll be, fun. It's fun to follow, and hopefully we can get involved a little bit with that. Let's see. Any other quick questions about all that stuff before I move on to another topic?
Does anyone want to hear some loon calls?
Yes. Although
Which should I
it's
start
nice to
with?
hear whatever it's nice to hear.
How about the tremolo?
Yep.
And Eric can explain it. You've all heard this.
With guitar.
I know. I'm glad we can't.
Anybody know the meaning of that one? When it wakes you up at 2 a.m.?
It's nighttime and we're happy. I don't know.
That's actually more of an alert call and sometimes an aggressive, distress call. So it's really saying, be aware what something's up. It's often what they'll do first if you definitely kayak in too close or boat in too close. They might give a whale call first. And this is more of an identification call. Who's down there? Where's my mate? Come home. I've been on the nest too long. Where's my chick? But I have heard the tremolo given in excitement, and an excitement being, I told the story last fall, but where there was a chick that was brought in, and they didn't know where it came from. People thought it was just a stranded bird. Ends up it was a loon chick. And a day and a half, it was about 24 hours later, I brought it back to where we thought it came from, and there's a bird incubating an egg, and realized that this chick had hatched within the 12 hours of it being picked up, and was stashed on shore to get away from an intruder loon. So I brought it back and was able to throw it out there and hope that they didn't kill it, which could happen. Anyway, the parents got really excited, and one of them just started tremoloing on the water, and the other one started yodeling on the nest, which is really cool. So it was the male that was on the nest at that time, and the female was dealing with this intruder. No, did I talk about yodels last fall? I should have written down what I talked about, but I had no idea. That was just the whirlwind. I've never spoken so many words in 50 minutes in my entire life.
You can talk about the yodel.
But so yodel is the male. Only males do it. I've seen female. They extend their neck when they do it, and they're down low. I have seen birds go down in that position, and nothing comes out. And it almost makes me wonder if it's the female just doing the posturing. Because that alone would also be a sign of defense and say something to an intruder bird. And that actually happened to Mary Holland and I took her out, and we were a good 100 yards, from here across the street from the nest. Yet this bird just did not like us sitting there in our canoe. And it came over and did this posturing at us. And it was really kind of like, come on, we're not doing anything. But it was just a super defensive bird. But it was, again, just going into posture. But the yodel, really what it's doing is it's talking to the other males especially, but it signifies fighting ability. The deeper the yodel, the deeper the frequency, what does that mean in the bird? Bigger bird. Bigger male. And they tend to not have as many problems with other intruders. Size matters. But you don't want to be so big that you can't migrate. It's kind of interesting. The loons in New England are anywhere from, the males, 5 to 6.5 pounds. So we're talking, 1,200, actually it can be 1,200 to 1,500 grams. Grams, yes. No, 15 kilograms. They can be up, not 15 kilograms, yeah? No, 5 kilograms. I'm thinking 5 to 6 kilograms. There we go. I'm doing my translations wrong here, or whatever. So anyway, 10 to 15 pounds. And whereas a Midwestern bird, a male might be 6 to 9 pounds. So much different, probably because of migrations. But at the same time, the gradation changes as you go up into the interior part of North America and get toward the coast. They're bigger out in the West Coast as well. The other part that it says is motivation. How motivated are you to defend? And so what they find is the smaller males tend to yodel more often. And they're giving more of those up and down notes at the end. They have the crescendo and then this up and down, up and down. This guy, Jay Major, who went to Cornell, worked with a guy named Charlie Walcott, and now is a professor in Northern Ohio. He recorded 28 of those up and down notes. Usually you just hear 5 or 6. He was also playing playbacks to kind of instigate the bird. And he's asking permission if we can go to some Vermont lakes this year. And I'm like, okay, where does nobody live? Because it's not only the loon you're going to upset. But,
what's the significance of the smaller one doing it more frequently?
It tells the other intruder that if he does more and more of it, it shows higher level of aggression. And it says that I may be smaller, but I'm not going to give in quick. So yeah, it's doing that. The other part is identity. They can definitely identify each other through this, and there's been a lot of research over that last 20 or 30 years of looking at the patterns of acoustic identification. But a neat thing that Jay's working on as well is not only is it dealing with the intruder loon that comes in, and intruders are birds that come in, they're inspecting the territory, they might consider a takeover attempt someday in the future, but they may not. They may just be getting familiar with the nest site, the pair, the lake, and so those birds are just going to stand a better chance of winning a spot in a territory if they're already familiar with the territory, and if they're familiar with the other birds. Because usually when there's a mate switch, it's one male will switch with a male, a female will switch with a female, but the other bird accepts the winner of the fight. And so knowing each other definitely helps in the transition of all of that. But an identity also, again, it's the yodel is not only being heard by the intruder that it's being aimed at, but it's being heard by its mate. Maybe that helps with pair bond strength. It's being heard by the bird at the other end of the lake who has another territory down there. It says, okay, you still occupy that territory, that's good, I still occupy this one. Or the lake nearby. And it sort of keeps the little social structure intact, potentially, of some of the ideas there. And then a little bit about those intruders. When you get another bird coming in and it's causing trouble, whether it's an actual fight or some chases or some posturing, because oftentimes it'll just look like they're having a little talk and then they split and go their separate ways. It doesn't look like a fight at all. But oftentimes there's a little bit of aggression, and that might just be like a bill sticking down a little bit, an elevated forebrow, the feathers sticking up a little bit. Those are all signs that there's some aggression going on. And it doesn't have to be a chase or a fight, or grabbing each other by the throat and trying to drown each other, which does happen.
But they're going to establish dominance just by the posturing?
Yep. And so yeah, that it's much better to I mean, in the bird world, actually, in all behavior science, they study this. You know, how do you avoid an actual fight? And it's actually beneficial to both parties to avoid the fight if you can figure that out before you get there. So it's always kind of interesting. But in Wisconsin, where there's about 100 lakes where almost all the breeding birds are banded, and it's been now going on for 20 years. That's where actually I started my loon work back in 1991, 92, was banding birds there. And so there's hundreds and hundreds of what are called ABJs, adults banded as juveniles. And so they're now getting these guys coming in and taking over territories and being part of this interaction. They're learning who they are. But in these intruder interactions, 60% of them are not banded, which indicates they're coming from pretty far away. And they're coming in, checking these places out. And then there's 30% are these ABJs. And those ABJs tend to come back within 20 to 30 miles of the lake they were born on, or hatched out on. And so they do kind of return to that same area.
Is that both males and females?
Mm-hmm. Although females tend to disperse a little bit further than males. And then 10% are banded birds who are on average coming from within 2.5 kilometers. So, I mean, this is on average, but you know, because those lakes are pretty tightly formed. And when a loon gets kicked out of its territory and then goes and tries to find another spot in a territory, the average length of movement away is about 2 or 3 kilometers. So it's to the other end of the lake. It's to the lake right next door. It's not 10 miles to an empty lake. They stay in their little vicinity. It's pretty interesting how they do that.
Now, is that one more likely to establish a territory nearby as opposed to another one coming in? The one that was kicked out of its own?
Oftentimes, because they're already familiar with all the nooks and crannies, and they're all familiar with the birds, and who maybe has a weak spot, or if a bird dies, it's the first one there. You know, there's lots of possibilities there. And speaking of who can get there first, there's some satellite telemetry work that's being done now. And there were 6 birds that were implanted with these units with little antennas. And this was up in Ranger Lakes in Maine. They've actually been doing it all over the place, but this was just one little specific study. 2 of them were males, and they both stayed on the Maine coast for the winter. 2 of the other ones that were females were down around the Cape, and one actually went all the way to Maryland. And so, you know, it's a very tiny sample size, but does that indicate that males are sticking closer to home and not migrating as far so that they can be the first ones back to get to that territory in the spring? You know, it's just sort of hypothetical, but it is known that males do show up usually a week or so before the females in the spring. So when the ice does finally go out, those males are going to be ready. In fact, we just had our first loon in Vermont who made a mistake and crash landed at the Berlin airport a week and a half ago. Probably was doing a flight straight from the coast, somewhere along the New England coast. Probably came up, realized, oh my gosh, there's nothing here. Sees a strip of black, perceived it as water, and luckily USDA has an office right there, and they got called, and he called Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and luckily they didn't think I was on board yet, so they didn't really call me, and they just took care of it. And they actually brought it down to Vince. Vince did an exam, just a few scratches on the feet. Otherwise, you know, a little thin, but not too, you know, not emaciated. So they released it just over here on the Connecticut. So hopefully that.
Why didn't it take off itself?
They can't take off from land.
Oh, they can't.
Nope, they need runways.
Different kind.
Water runways. Wrong kind. Except for red-throated loons. Supposedly they can take off from land. So I'll segue into that. There's been a bunch of research recently on red-throated loons, mainly in the wintering grounds. This is a BRI landed a grant from, I can't remember, whatever the oceanographic group that deals with offshore wind turbines, of all things. And they're looking at the sighting of these guys. And so what they're looking at white-winged scoters and, what's the other species they're looking at? Gannets. And they're trying to figure out, you know, where are they hanging out, where are they feeding, what relation. So they've been out there banding red-throated loons And they, through breeding bird survey, they got an idea of where their hangouts are, and really what they're focused on is the Delaware Bay, the Chesapeake Bay, and Pamlico Sound. And there's probably an estimate of about 70,000 red-throated loons overwintering. So they do come through here, and they'll be seen here in Lake Champlain. And so far they've implanted 66 of these satellite telemetry units to be able to figure out kind of what are they doing, where are they hanging out. And some of the things they're finding, the average female weight is about 4 pounds. The average male weight is about 5 pounds. They're finding that the birds are really kind of hanging out in waters less than 20 meters, so 60 feet or less, and within 4 miles of shorelines. They're really not finding them further out. And this is based on sort of doing transects across these bays and the open waters, seeing where they are, as well as the nighttime captures where they, nighttime capture in the winter for any of these birds, it's pretty much you boat along with a 20-foot handled net rather than an 8-foot handled net, and you just kind of go for it. And the success rate's a lot less, but they actually are able to get quite a few. Then they actually bring them into shore to a vet office, and they work with some vets down there, so anesthetize them, put them under, do the implant, and release, and then be able to follow them. And so it's likely a lot of these birds are keying in on fishing areas where there's just good fish. The surf scoters, those are keying in on mussels. They're working on the statistical analysis right now, looking at all the different factors that they have measured, from substrate to some of the aquatic life that's in those areas to some other things that they're able to assess. But some of the more interesting things, besides just sort of finding out where these guys are hanging out down there, which is really what the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, that's what they're interested in, but they're able to follow these birds now. And so what they're doing is they've been able to follow them up to the Cape, where there's kind of a staging area in the spring migration, and then they're making their way up to the Bay of Fundy, and then jump into the St. Lawrence Seaway, and then most of them are making their way to Hudson's Bay. A few are going to the east and up toward Greenland, so they kind of spread out. But of these 66 birds that they banded, they're from Greenland all the way 2/3 across Canada, way up in Banks Island. And there was actually some banding up on Victoria Island, which is way up north of Hudson's Bay up there. One of those birds actually overwintered in Japan. So some are coming down this way, some are going the other way. And it's like, how the heck do they determine who goes where and all of those things? It's absolutely phenomenal. But then what they're finding on the return route is that they go down to Hudson's Bay, and then they actually do their molt in the fall. Whereas common loons, they molt in February. They do their complete molt in February and early March. And so that's when those guys have the time to sort of sit still and not have to be flying around. Whereas there's this big 6 to 8 week window, late fall before they head south, where they're kind of following the currents down the western shore of the Hudson's Bay. Then they go to the Great Lakes, most of them. A few kind of went east, but those tended to be the eastern birds. But the rest of them were going down to the Great Lakes instead of over the St. Lawrence, which is the way they were headed up north. And then from there, they make their way down to the Chesapeake and disperse along the coastline. So pretty neat that way. What's also neat is red-throated loons, they're much shorter incubation time, and the chicks are ready to fledge and be cruising around and flying at 6 to 7 weeks of age. Whereas loons, Minnesota loon can fly at 8 to 9 weeks, whereas our birds out here, it's more like in the 11 to 12 week range. The genetics of who they are and how big they are, it just takes that much longer. So yeah, pretty neat. Some of the other winter stuff that's been going on is following the Gulf oil spill. And Jim Peruk, who actually I got to work with back in 91, 92. And in fact, anyone who wants to, he does an Earthwatch volunteer cruise. And he's an amazing teacher, really fun guy. And he was working with Earthwatch up in Seney National Wildlife Refuge when I met him. We were following the banded birds. Ends up we're both colorblind with reds and greens, and we're trying to identify red, green, blue, yellow. You can tell, but it's just a lot harder. So I don't know what Dave Evers was thinking in hiring both of us for doing it. So anyway, he's kept going. But he's been doing a lot of the work and they were doing contaminant, they were doing blood samples and things like that. And what they were finding is things called PAHs. And I really know nothing about oil and how it goes through the system. But with those the year right after the oil spill, they weren't finding very high levels, but it was like 2 and 3 years later that they were finding some higher levels. And he didn't give an update this year on where that is going, but it's just, again, preliminary stuff that there might be some residual things going on with oils and getting into the food chain, and how all that works.
Is that the stuff that, maybe it's because of the stuff they're dispersing it with? I just recently read with
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
breeding a problem.
Yeah, definitely worth checking into more. But some of the stuff that he's done, though, is following just getting some winter behavior. Do birds come back? And what they're finding is a lot of the adults are returning to the same location in the wintering time. It's like they develop a spot. Whereas these 1 and 2 year old birds, the subadults, when they're coming back, they've caught a lot of them. In fact, most of the birds they catch are these subadult birds. But they're not recapturing them and they're not resighting them. So, in following years. And this happens both, one study area, Morro Bay in California, where there was about a 7-year study. None of the immatures, the 1 and 2 year olds, were ever seen again. But the adults, one bird came back 6 years in a row. And it's clear water, they could easily see it. And then the average adult was there for 3 years at least. So that was pretty neat that they're kind of figuring that out.
They migrate as pairs, or they?
No, they don't. They definitely go as individuals. And I'll get onto that subject next. But
And you're talking about rednecks.
no, these are commons now. Yeah, red-throated. But yeah, no, these are commons I'm talking about now. And so what he's finding though is that so the adults are coming back, and when you put that into a model for mark recapture type studies, it's about 80% return rate is sort of based on this small sample size of birds coming back. In Louisiana, where he's been doing the work, the water is so thick, you put your hand in it, you can't see. So these loons have a whole different strategy of feeding. And so, it's not find the bird or find the fish and go after it. It's more like poke along, see something moving, grab it. And a majority of their diet in here is crabs, and occasionally like a flounder. But that's really what they're eating. And with a crab, it's not moving very fast, so they're actually able to grab it. But to show that these birds are coming back year after year after year indicates they're getting enough food. If they weren't, they probably wouldn't be coming back year after year. So that's kind of interesting that they're doing that. And their recaptures is not on sightings because they can't see the legs underwater when they're out there in the daylight. It's just too murky, that water. So they've actually recaptured, I think it's 5 or 6 of the, I can't remember what the numbers were, 20 or 30 adults, just by doing transects at night. And you come along a loon and you grab it by luck, and it happened to have a band on it, that they banded the year before or 2 years before. And I think I did mention the story last year, but 2 of the ones, they actually did do 2 satellite telemetry studies on 2 of these birds. And when he picked these birds up, he spent a lot of time in Minnesota, Wisconsin, where there's small loons, but these guys were even smaller. And he's like, who the heck are they? Where are they from? Ends up, one of them went straight up to the Great Lakes, spent some time there in the spring, and then made their way to northern Saskatchewan. The other bird went over the panhandle of Florida, up to the Chesapeake. These are birds that were caught right next to each other, into the Great Lakes, and then went to northern Saskatchewan. The next fall, they both did the reverse migration the same way. One went down through the Chesapeake, the other went down through the Great Lakes. So, pretty amazing how, you'll kind of a learned behavior type thing.
Now, those small ones breed or no?
Yeah.
They did.
Yep, they were headed up there. Actually, I don't know about those specific 2, but these are definitely breeding adults of age.
Do they have to fight for territory when they winter too, or do they just?
They tend to be more spread out, but it may be different. Like Louisiana, where they're the murky waters, he said the loons are kind of all over the place. They've never really seen any group feeding at all. They have seen some of that with others in other places, like off the California coast. I think there's been some ideas that there's been some group feeding where they're finding a school of fish together and then going out from that. So, yeah. Anyway, anything else on winter stuff there? No, that's. But that does lead into some of the other. We were talking about males and females. Do they migrate separately or together? Another guy for BRI has been able to spend some time the last few years following banded birds, and in the fall, and just to kind of see what they're up to. And he was able to, he followed 32 territories over the last 2 falls. And these are places, most of them were banded birds, or at least one of them was banded. And so they could tell who the male is and who the female was. And they would, the strategy was to go out every, twice a week and see if the birds were present with their chicks and figure out when does the first adult leave, when does the second adult leave, when does the first chick leave, when does the second chick leave. And if they had 2 surveys in a row that they did not see any birds, they made the assumption that they had left the lake. Although he now qualifies that. They don't necessarily have migrated at that time. They may have just moved next door. So there's a possibility, and they may come back at some point, because they did find that in a few cases. But the average departure date for the first adult is October 10th. So this is sort of central and northern New Hampshire, is what this is based on. But the range was September 3rd. 1 adult left, leaving the family. The first adult to leave on the late end was November 2nd. So 1 bird stuck around but then departed. The second adult, the average departure date was 2 weeks later, October 27th. So tended to stick around. Females, 62% of the time departed first. So it's not divided, it's not really totally one's male or female, but definitely females were leaving a little bit earlier. And then the range was from September 19th, and there were 3 or 4 cases where both adults had left by the end of September, and leaving the chicks on the lake. But the second adult was also present past November 20th when they wrapped up the study. So some adults will stick around into late November, even into December, and I've seen that here. For chicks, the average, and he was started combining 1 and 2 chick families, so it's kind of hard to tell if it was just a 1 chick clutch or a 2 chick clutch, but the average last chick departure date was October 30th. So they tend to leave within 3 to 5 days, 6 days after that second adult. It's almost like there's a queue. It's like once those adults go, time for me to go too if I can.
Excuse me, how do they know where to go? They don't follow the adults.
That's the magic of migration.
Huh.
Yeah. It's phenomenal how they can, whether they figure it out. Yeah.
Do the chicks return with the adult ones?
Nope. The chicks will usually spend 2 or 3 years on the ocean before they return as adults, and even then they may not come right back. But male chicks tend to return within 20 miles of the lake they came from. Females tend to be a little further afield, 30, 40 miles, but hard to say.
Do you see short migrations like right down to Cape Cod?
Yep, for New England birds.
Yes.
Yep, and so some of those birds are probably doing it in a single flight.
Yeah.
And some of the telemetry has shown there was a New York Adirondack bird that took 5 or 6 days. But most of them were 1 or 2 days to get to the Cape or off Maine coast.
Now, they don't migrate as couples or breeding groups or as families, but to the ones that leave, do they leave with some other males? Or
Sometimes they do, in the sense, and this is more circumspect. I don't know if I've actually seen a study on it, but I actually got into birds working at Whitefish Point Bird Observatory up in the UP of Michigan on Lake Superior, where the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald took place right off that point. And so almost every year there was a 2-day window between May 10th and May 14th where upward of 2,000 to 3,000 loons would fly over in 2 days. And most of that in a 2 to 3 hour window in the morning, which indicates that they're rafting up on Lake Huron, and then whoosh, off they go to make their way through. And it was like clockwork. There was like really this 4-day window where there was 2 days of intense migration and then more loose. But it would be 1 bird there, then 2, and then 1, and it sort of spread out over the day. But they definitely must have been sort of congregating at night.
When the juveniles go to the saltwater and stay for a couple of years, do they look like loons?
They're white throat, gray-brown in the back, so they look like a big chick. And it's really hard actually to tell a 1 and 2 year old from a 14-week-old chick. They look a lot alike. And so in fact, back in the 90s, we had upward of 20 to 25 of these subadults or immatures. I've used the word subadult because immatures sometimes get people confused with a big chick. They're juveniles, and I use big chick instead of juvenile. It's just a little easier. And so back in the 90s, when we had more open water, we tended to see more of these 1 and 2 year olds come back and just sort of hang out for the summer. But recently we're only picking up 2, 3, 4 of them in our annual count, compared to 10, 15, 20 back in the 90s. So it's almost like those birds, as they age, they kind of filled the slots, but they're also low on the totem pole as far as hierarchy. So they're going to get chased off. They're going to have to fend for themselves and be really careful when they're around breeding adults who are very defensive. So it's more advantageous not to get near breeding birds, so they're not coming back early. But the 2-year-olds will actually start having a few dots on them, and they start, but not totally. So they're going into sort of some adult idea look. The 3-year-olds, I was just rereading kind of a little paper about some loons that were bred in captivity at the Minnesota Zoo. A guy named Jim Peruke, really neat guy, who actually he's an expert at hatching eggs. So they got permits to collect eggs. He incubated them, and then was able to hand rear these chicks. He'll never do a loon again in his life. He did like 10 of them or 12 of them, and all but one died within 4 months. I mean, they could have been healthy, looked fine, and then boom, they're dead. He's like, what is going on? And, again, all these diseases that are in, with other birds around. But one lived to be 4 years old, and so they really followed the molt pattern of that guy and really got it down. And the 3-year-old definitely had not quite totally adult plumage. There was still some little gray feathers in there, brown feathers, but definitely was more like an adult. And now in Wisconsin, they've definitely documented 3 or 4 3-year-olds breeding. So they can breed at 3. But more likely, on average, they don't nest until they're 6 or 7 years old. They're coming back again. Territories are occupied. They don't give them up that easy. They're very mate faithful, site faithful. Actually, more site faithful than mate faithful. But they're 80% of the time both pairs return. Then there's a switch. Only 20% of the time. And when there's a switch, it's usually just one bird. There's almost rarely ever a double switch where they're both replaced. Partly because of knowledge of the territory. Is really important.
I had one double switch.
Did they nest that year?
Yes, actually.
Wow. Because oftentimes, even when there's a single switch in one of the birds, they often will take a year or 2 off. And not that they mean to take a year or 2 off, but it takes that long to either get the pair together so they really know what's going on, or to help defend themselves from the other birds in the area, because they may spend so much time sort of re-establishing a territory amongst the other loons that they just don't get around to breeding. But also they also fail more often when they're new like that. And it may not even be a new bird. It could be a 12-year-old bird that's found another spot back in. But anyway.
How about the loons that stay off the coast in the ocean during the summer? Are they juveniles or?
A lot. I don't know if it would be the majority, but my guess is it would be the 1 and 2-year-olds, occasionally 3.
So they don't breed if they're in salt water.
Not normally. There has been one account back in the 80s, I think, where there was a documented nest attempt on some rocks, and they found eggs that were broken. And it always makes me kind of wonder, what was it like during the glacial period, 12,000 years ago, and 20,000 years ago, when were there sort of open? There probably were some lakes that were just south from melted water, and that they were on. But the landscape must have been so different than what we see today, and definitely breeding on the ocean with tides. Could they figure it out and get on and off and make a trek? They can't walk on land. We've seen birds make 20, 30-foot treks back and forth from a nest when there's a drawdown from a reservoir, and as long as it doesn't get depredated or something, they might stick to it, especially if it happens late in the incubation period. They become more sticky to the nest, or stickers we call it. Versus if there's a disruption in the first week, they're more likely to abandon the nest. Whereas the longer it gets, the more committed they become, and they're gonna hang right out there. I had a bird this spring on Lake Eden. Big rainstorm. We already knew that the nest was right at waterline, and I went out there, and the bird was like trying to throw mud and stuff onto it. And I've done this twice, where I've gone out and I've actually picked the eggs up and built the nest up and put the eggs back in. I think I was too late for this one. I think the eggs had already been in the water. But literally, I had a bucket of stuff that I was just going to throw on and put the eggs back up. That bird didn't move. My hand was like on the loon's back, and I'm like, "Can you let me get in here?" And it was pretty incredible this bird's just kind of looking at me. He wasn't aggressive at me. usually they might be, but
It's like saying, you don't see me.
Right. Whereas the other time that happened, the loon was in there frantically throwing vegetation on, and the eggs were just in a little tiny bit of water. My mom was with me up on Green River Reservoir, and we took the eggs, and I put a bucket on, and we built it all up. Well, that loon was doing the penguin dance and everything, from me to you, and I'm just like going as fast as I can and got out of there. We waited about half an hour, and the bird got back on and hatched a week later. So we do invasive things like that once in a while. I usually don't put those in the reports. And usually I don't tell my boss, but it's a do good thing. So.
How long do the loons live for? Like how many years?
Still don't know for certain because the banding has really only been in large scale since about 1990, and we're still seeing some of those birds that were banded in the early 90s coming back. So 20 to 30 years is the guess. But it seems like their peak of breeding is somewhere between 6 and 10, and then they seem to get muddled around a little bit more. There's kind of a neat, interesting story. It's one that's in progress right now, and it's definitely a concern, is on Squam Lake in New Hampshire. Back in the early 2000s, half the pairs disappeared. They didn't come back the next year. There were 15 pairs, 16 pairs on the lake. Lots of islands, lots of bays. It seems like perfect loon country. Only 6 or 7 pairs came back in like 2003 or 4. I can't remember the exact year. Well, the pairs are now back. It seems like there's back up to 14, 15 pairs. But literally, they are lucky to produce 1 chick a year on that entire lake. It's just nest success, chick loss, failed, thinking about nesting but not actually nesting. And it's crazy. It's really wild what they're seeing there. And we've seen it on some other big lakes in Maine. And Bagog had the same thing where they lost about half their birds one year. And what's interesting is a lot of these birds were banded, especially up in Bagog and a lot of the surrounding lakes. The little lakes all around cranking out the chicks, no problem. The big lakes, it's like something's going on. And is it food related? What caused the disappearance in the first place? Was it a winter kill? But again, if it was a wider spread winter event, like an oil spill, there was a big oil spill in '97 and another one in 2003, where upward of 200 to 300, if not 500 or 600 loons died right off the New England coast from these minor oil spills. But we weren't seeing them disappear in other places, so it's like this is what got affected. So what they're finding though is that I'm actually going to write a little bit in the newsletter for this summer's newsletter. It's sort of social chaos is what we're kind of calling it. It seems like when there's a disturbance in a disruption in the pair, so if there's this change in the mate, and we often see this, there'll often be a year or two of no nesting, is that if there's been a switch in one of the mates or both mates. And it takes a while for that to kind of reconfigure and get associated with all the other loons in the area. But on these big lakes where loons can just swim in and out of each other's territory, nest success rate and breeding success rate's already much lower than on single territories like a 100, 150 acre lake. Because it takes a lot of effort to fly in. But when you're on a big multiple territory lake, it's easy to swim right in. And you cause trouble and then leave if you don't like what's going on. But you can be causing trouble every day. Whereas the fly in, you seem to see, on these little lakes, you seem to see 1 or 2 years of lots of intruder activity. And then you get 5 years of very little intruder activity. It seems like the pair is like, okay, my Yodel's really good this year, and the next 5 years, and you're not getting after me, and no problem. But then all of a sudden that male becomes weak, and actually males do lose weight if they breed every year. They lose like 50 grams a year or something like that, and it adds up after 5 or 6 years. And so it may make that male a little more, and this is after successful captures of those birds over time. So anyway, what they're seeing on Squam is that a female's getting kicked out, moves to the next territory, kicks out another female. That female moves, literally over to that point and then to that bay. Right next door. They're just all these little shifts, and it's a snowball domino effect. Just like boom, 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 boom. These territories getting switched around, and there's no established routine. And it's like, is it going to stabilize or not? And there's been at least 4 territories with females that are kind of in this chaos right now, and 6 with males of the 15 or 16. And they're just either not nesting or they're just not sticking to the nest. And they usually don't even get to the chick stage for most of those. So it's just kind of this interesting thing. And on a real positive note, productivity on Winnipesaukee has been like 1 or 2, 3, 4 chicks on this lake with 30 pairs on it. Last year they had 23 chicks. It's like an all-time record. I mean, it was like the perfect storm for these birds. I mean, something gelled and allowing that to happen. It could be water levels. It could have been that it was rainy on every Friday and Saturday, Sunday during the peak of nesting. You know, who knows what it was, but it seems to.
How many survived you, do they know?
I'm not sure the exact stats. So, but anyway, pretty neat that some of those things are happening there.
Has the rebound of eagle population?
Yeah. Okay, that was another topic. Chris Martin from New Hampshire Audubon got together with a statistician, and they were kind of looking at all the loon nesting successes, nesting failures, and they did totally beyond me as far as what they were trying to exactly capture in this model. But they were looking at all the major factors on some other modeling of what makes loons nest successful. And I could actually give you the figures. They had 1,544 successful loon nests in the model and 2,900 nest failures. And that would include renests, I think. And of those, 391 of them were within 2.5 kilometers. I think that was the figure. It may have been 5 kilometers of an eagle nest. So they just looked at those 291. 95 were successful. 296 were failures. And then they built a model so that they could remove the effect of the eagle and say, what is that statistically significant based on all the other parameters that said whether it should be successful or not. And it ends up it was pretty significant that the eagles definitely were having an impact on nesting success. We definitely had a chick taken from Nichols Pond this year. It was observed being grabbed and brought up into the trees. We've had other encounters like that where the chicks actually survived the attacks. We had a 5-week-old chick up on Holland Pond a few years ago, actually carried about 100 yards and then eagle dropped it. And that loon survived to tell the tale. So you can think of the therapy sessions that bird's had to go through.
I remember up near Burton Island, maybe it was Woods Island, maybe 25 years ago, a local great horned owl had figured out where the terns nested and would fly out, grab them, and until they put those little cages over. Has that been studied?
Oh yeah. They're using them a lot in Maine and a little bit in New Hampshire. They call them aerial guards.
Oh, you mean to protect them against the great horned owls or against
protect
the
them against the eagles.
Yeah.
So we're putting them over loon rafts. So it's to protect the nest and keep that from happening. They're definitely finding some of the eagle, the birds that are nesting out on more exposed islands, they're definitely more exposed. Whereas if they might be back in a marsh with lots of vegetation, maybe a little less likely to get depredated or taken. Because eagles will take both eggs and chicks. Some of the first banding work all occurred in Seney National Wildlife Refuge up in the UP of Michigan. And the manager ref, it's all these series of pools, created, but there's like 20, 30 pairs of loons in all these pools, along with lots of eagles. And the guy goes, well, yeah, eagle might take a loon here or there, but it's not a big deal. Well, they went up to do some work on the eagle chicks to take a, band them, take a feather sample. They went up there, they found 25 loon bands. So whether they were adults or chicks, I can't, it was a mixture. Most of the adults were probably compromised adults, scavenged, because they really can't lift a full adult loon. And I've actually seen eagles give up on a loon that was swimming in a hole of ice. I mean, it was trying to get on the loon, it grabbed the loon, but then it would jump to the side and then grab the loon again. And then an hour or two later, me and the fire department showed up and went out and grabbed that loon. So I got actually scolded for interfering with eagles and eating a natural prey. And I was like, well, so it goes. Yeah, let's open it up. Questions, comments?
Winter attrition, and what are the main predators in the sea?
It's probably more stress related in the winter. Just becoming weak, not eating right, something like that. The expected mortality or survivorship or mortality rate is about 8 or 9% for adults in a typical year. That's the revised figure as of recent. Whereas for the younger birds, it's more probably like 50-60% in those first 2 or 3 years. In our chick survival rate, actually like fledging from the pond, we usually see about 70-75% of our chicks make it to September. And then we assume that they're getting off. Not all of them probably do, but that's kind of what the figure is right now. There's a question over here.
Yes, do any of the loons you're studying demonstrate what we might call gay behavior? A male who shows companionship to another male or female to female?
I'll have to ask Walter Piper that one, because he's following the banded birds. But what they have found is they have found some inbreeding. Chicks coming back, mating with one of their parents. In a few cases, it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen occasionally. So they probably don't have the recognition of a parent. You know, it's been 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And, you know, the whole, you know, the Ice Age thing, you know, probably created a huge genetic bottleneck. In fact, there's 2 people who've been doing genetic work, and they're having a really hard time differentiating, finding anything that stands out as different from one loon to another. They're definitely much more similar than alike, and they're finding a few regional differences between the East, Midwest, and the West, which you kind of expect to see something like that. And there seems to be a little bit of a dividing line, but it's not been easy, and so there probably is just not a lot of genetic diversity in these birds. They probably were down to even smaller numbers at some point, not too long ago.
What exactly constitutes generally a loon fight? What do they do to fight with each other? I heard you mention like grounding, but
Yeah. It would be, again, most of the fights don't actually. I mean, they break off before they get to that stage, because they're just a bird will fly in, the pair will confront it, or one of the birds will confront it. They'll escort that bird away from the nest or from the chick, or just bring it out in the territory. If it's a small lake, they'll pursue that bird until it leaves. But oftentimes there's a half an hour, 20 minutes of them kind of social interaction where they're just kind of swimming in a little circle together, and it looks like they're having a conversation. Most of the time that's what you see, and then all of a sudden the bird will just kind of go off and then either fly off the lake or swim to another side if it's a bigger lake. But occasionally it erupts into wing rowing, where they'll start chasing each other. One will just sort of flap its wings along the water and they'll be on their belly, kind of like a float plane cruising across the water. And that can go on for hours, if not on and off for days. That's been observed. Oftentimes one bird will beach itself if it gets exhausted. I get calls like that all the time, and it's like, well, are there other birds out there? And it's just getting away from it. And most of those birds do survive once they recover, if they can get off the pond. So that can happen. And then very rarely do the actual encounters occur where they actually grab each other. And it's oftentimes, they'll often come up in a penguin dance and try to grab each other by the throat. And it's usually males. Females tend to be nicer to each other. And injury or mortality occurs in a huge percent of male fights when it does happen, whereas in females it's much less. Although I got to find out what went on, because we actually had 2 females that died from what were definitely loon-inflicted injuries. But they also were talking about, you see holes in the sternum. But when they're fighting, they often don't fight by doing that. So it's almost like a bird that's already dying or not doing well. Those are the ones that get pummeled from below, and someone gets punctured. So they're not always this cute, fluffy animal that you can adore to. In fact, there's a volunteer who I didn't hear from last year, and I emailed her, I called her. Finally, I was over on the lake checking because I hadn't heard from her, and she goes, I've had to step back because the year before she was out in her kayak, and a chick got attacked by another loon and killed 10 feet from her. And it was just so traumatic for her. She's just like, I got to step back. And I'm glad I got to talk to her and finally catch up on that. But it was just, yeah. So.
Is the mosquito the vector for the malaria and avian malaria? And if so, how does it penetrate into a loon?
They get in there.
It just works.
Yeah. And so, whether it's an actual issue or not, we don't know yet. But one insect that is black flies. Upward of, and if it's the wrong week where black flies are peaking, there's actually a black fly that's specific to loons, and not us and other things. But they've seen in Wisconsin upward of 50 to 60% nest failure rate, likely due to black flies. They're just getting swarmed so badly. Usually it happens in later May, and that's early enough that most of those birds will re-nest, and they can be successful then the second time around. So it's almost like, just wait, guys,
But the black fly inflicted death is from malaria? Or-
No, that's just from being a pest.
Oh, okay.
Not actually killing the bird. It's just or anything like that. They just can't sit there on the nest for 4 hours because they sit on the nest for about 4 or 5 hours before they switch places. Yeah.
How common is it for the loons to attach ducklings and other birds like that? I've seen that.
I think it's kind of like human genetics. You know, there's some of us that are a little more easily riled and others who are a little more passive. And I think there's a few rogue loons out there that make a bad name for all the other loons. I mean, literally, there are birds that are super highly aggressive. And if they see a duck anywhere near their nesting area, they will just pummel it. And we had a bird on Woodbury, and this was a half mile from the nesting area. If it saw ducks, it would kill them. And I mean, this was witnessed by a lot of people on that lake. And I was just like, oh, sheesh, you know. And unfortunately, one of the times it attacked the ducks, the lady's 5-year-old grandkid was in the water next to the ducks, and the loon reared right in front of the kid. And luckily, nothing happened. But that was one irate lady. Roz helped me figure that one out. You know, it's like, what do we do? I was like, we were trying to think all sorts of things. Essentially, she's like, well, loons are in the endangered list? Well, this one's gonna be. And she was so angry. But so essentially it was like, well, if the ducks are right there, maybe don't swim with the ducks. You know, or if the loons are anywhere nearby, get the kid out. You know, you got to change your behavior too.
Around here, where's the best place to see loons in the wild?
There's a Kent Pond. Oh, Grafton, in New Hampshire. But they aren't bad. Kent Pond, there's the boat access and the dike, the dam. And so with binoculars, you can see that entire lake. And there's a pair there.
Does everyone know where that is? On Sherburne, is it? On Route 4?
Killington.
Just before you get to Killington?
Go north on 107, about a quarter mile off Route 4. And it's on the right there. And they've been breeding there for about only 4 or 5 years. So it's a pretty new pair. But as far as being able to observe them, that one's really good for something down here.
I think there are a couple of pair on Mascoma also.
Okay. The nearest pond here to the north is Miller Pond. They've now nested there 2 years. We've got definite activity on Maury. In fact, one year we almost had like 2 twosomes, and they may have just been temporary pairs, but I think it's just a matter of time before they try to nest in the north end of Lake Maury. 2 years ago, we had some consistent pair activity on Fairleigh. Last year, that pair just didn't. I think they probably moved on to something else. They were seen on and off, but once the summer season got going, that lake gets pretty busy. And then other ones are Woodward Reservoir and Lake Nineveh, but there they can just be a little further out and harder to see from shore. But if you have boats, those are definitely okay places to go. But we're now seeing, we have now nesting on Chittenden Reservoir, Lake Dunmore, and some nice more isolated, like Wallingford Pond and Spring Lake are kind of neat.
I have a couple hundred loons in front of my place, and I take care of long pasture for Audubon on the Cape.
Okay.
How come you never hear of it?
They don't call much in the wintertime.
I never hear them at all.
In the summer too. I mean, when they're not on territory. It's territorial stuff that really is why they're calling. And again,
we have a large group there.
Yeah, I mean that's probably one of the big migration or wintering spots is up and down that area. We used to think originally maybe our birds go to Florida. There was a die-off in Florida that coincided with the crash in Vermont back in 1983. We now know that for the most part our birds are just off the New England coast, but there have been a few cases of some New York and Maine birds who we're seeing all the way down in the Chesapeake area, in North Carolina, and even one I think went all the way to Florida. So you do get these sort of outliers that just kind of head out and just keep going. Winters like this, why not? It'd be tough. So.
Have any of them been established, like at Fairfield Pond, up toward the islands?
Fairfield up in northwestern Vermont?
By St. Albans.
Yeah. They nested last year for the first time ever.
In Fairfield Pond?
In Fairfield Pond.
All right.
It was a failed nest, but this year we'll be ready to put signs out.
Nice.
I'm trying not to put a raft out because there is an island, but that island is used by anglers and fishermen and picnickers, and so we're going to see how it goes. If after a year or two we aren't seeing success, maybe we'll consider a raft try to draw them out, but who knows if that'll work or not. Miller Pond is another one up there that they've been successful.
Talk just a little bit about your behavior, I mean, people's behavior towards when they see loons or chicks, because that's a constant headache for me. I talk to people, my mother used to say, Mary, don't holler. I said, Mom, I have to.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of tell people, watch from a distance and let them come to you.
What's a good distance?
I always say, 200 or 300 feet, and then just drift. You could get upwind from them and sort of drift down with them a little bit and just see what happens, but be ready to back off slowly. But once you get close, don't make any moves, big moves. At the same time, though, they can tolerate a heck of a lot, and it bugs us more than it actually maybe bugs them sometimes. Because as long as they're not getting harassed constantly, they're going to find time for feeding. If they start giving calls and signals that say, hey, you're too close, then definitely get out of there.
But people don't understand that. I mean,
Yeah.
Martin's Pond, which is where my left is, they get out in their kayaks and, the thing is to go around the pond
And sometimes they, you can't help it. I mean, they just swim right in front of you, or you're cruising
well,
a little
that's
bit.
their problem.
Yeah.
When you,
Yeah, you got to figure that one out. I mean, I was out with a group of 15 one time on Peachum Pond, and we were just there was a group of 10 loons, and we were like, cool, okay, we'll just all go to this point. But as we headed to the point, the whole group of 10 came right in, totally, I mean, there was a loon between every boat, and it was like, okay, everybody, just go slow. And I mean, luckily they were so preoccupied with each other compared to with a loon family. This wasn't a loon family by me. Totally behavior difference when there's chicks around.
yeah, you see, that's what I see is that they've stashed the chicks on the shore, and then they come out from the shore, and then the kayaks are going between the adults and the chicks, and that does stress them out.
Yeah.
And they kind of swim towards you, kind of threatening, but.
And again, you'll get different loons that are more aggressive than other
friendly.
ones. Some who are going to approach you no matter what you do, other ones who seem super, super tolerant. They definitely, have adapted well to people for the most part, and they do, often sometimes too much. But at the they don't even get out of the way of motorboats on Winnipesaukee sometimes, and that's where you see actually some boat hits. But at the same time, the nesting site and when they're with the chicks, those are the two kind of like critical pieces. But at the other time, we can be out there enjoying and watching and all of that. And I'll take one or two questions, and then otherwise I'll stick around for a while. Mitzi.
I should know. How do you tell the male from the female? Just by their song, by their call?
If you hear the yodel,
Yeah.
but other than that, unless you get them right side by side and the male's 3 pounds heavier, 4 pounds heavier than that female, it's going to be really hard to tell them apart because one might be lower or higher in the water, but males are always bigger. And so that's the easiest way. So sometimes it's just substantial. That neck and that head are just so much bigger than the other one. So that's really the only way. Otherwise, though, from a distance, if you see two birds, you're most likely not going to be able to tell them apart, and you just kind of have to watch.
In regards to introduced species or invasive species in some of the small lakes and ponds, are you seeing any problems with potential food for the loons?
It's definitely on the radar. There was a small little study in New Hampshire that looked at Eurasian milfoil, and they're actually looking at it, is there an effect from the chemical treatment that knocked the milfoil back? And it was kind of interesting. They actually found that, and I don't think the sample size is big enough to make a real statistical thing, but productivity increased after treatment of chicks. And so the clearing of the water may have improved the ability to get food for those chicks. And so in that case, but as we know, Eurasian milfoil is widely variable in how much it takes over a lake. Some lakes it seems to be like everywhere and thick. Other lakes it seems to be like one bay, and there's a lot of deep water that may not be quite so affected. So there's definitely some long-term concerns if bays do get totally covered with a milfoil.
How about introduced fish that are bigger and are taking the smaller fish?
Yeah, changes in the food web. Definitely they like perch, and small schooling fish, bait fish type size. And that's why you don't see them come to the surface when they're eating those, because they're swallowing up underwater. It's those 15-inch lunkers that they got to bring to the top. So, and loons have choked to death. There's been several incidents where they found birds that are just. In fact, we had a bird on Nelson Pond 2 years ago, and it got pummeled by another loon, and I found the holes in it and sent it down. Ends up it had a fish that was like 12 or 13 inches in its throat that I couldn't see. It was in the throat, and whether this guy was already sort of choking, and then he got nailed,
No, they were trying to do the Heimlich.
or whether he was enjoying his meal and couldn't defend himself, hard to say. So, well, thanks for being a great audience. Lots of fun. If anybody needs an excuse to kayak, go to the BC website, get hold of me. There's a form called the Casual Lake or Casual Loon Survey. And it's lakes that we just want to get more surveys from. And you can go, it's not like Loon Watch Day where you have to go the third Saturday of July at 8 in the morning. This is like, go to these lakes at any time, anywhere, and do it on your own schedule. Pick up 4 or 5 lakes, and go up, check those out in a day and then come back. It's a great excuse to go visit some different lakes that maybe you've never been. So,
and you can do any lake at any time?
Right, it's just to get more surveys. It's often lakes that don't have breeding, or breeding lakes that I don't have many volunteers on. Okay. That's what they're targeted as. Oh, right. And I have them listed from like a hierarchy of 1 to 3, 1 being breeding, 2 being loon active. And those are the loon active lakes are really important, like Morey and Fairleigh. Are we getting pair activity? Are they investigating anything in late May, early June for potential nest sites? And more often than not, between me and volunteers, we're catching new pairs forming, and then we are there the next spring. It puts it on our list to watch, and then we know where to look for nests, marshes, islands, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, we see something happening, we contact the landowner. Sometimes we even contact landowners ahead of time, a year or 2 ahead, just to see, okay, how do you use this land? Is it going to be potential habitat? And that's made a huge difference, I think, in just giving those loons a chance right off the bat by knowing where those pairs are forming. All right, well, have a great summer season.
Large enough